Can anyone comprehend how, in contemporary Africa, you honor your invader who killed your soldiers and violate your country's sovereignty? This week, Uganda's own military commander unveiled a statue on Ugandan soil, honoring a foreign soldier who led an armed raid into Uganda without its consent. 45 Ugandan soldiers died defending their country that night. Uganda just built a monument to the man who killed them. On August 1, 2026, Uganda's military chief, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, son of President Museveni, unveiled a bronze statue of Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, brother of Israel's current prime minister, at Entebbe's old airport terminal. 50 years ago, Netanyahu led Israeli commandos in a raid to rescue hostages hijacked by Palestinian and German militants. The raid succeeded, but in the process, Israeli forces killed 45 Ugandan soldiers and destroyed Uganda's air force on the ground. Even the American press covering this event at the time has acknowledged plainly, this mission, quote, breached Uganda's territorial integrity. Here's the first uncomfortable question. Sovereignty and territorial integrity are not soft diplomatic suggestions. They are cardinal, non-negotiable principles of international law, enshrined in Article 2-4 of the UN Charter. No state on earth negotiates this principle away. Yet Uganda's own military has just erected a monument on Ugandan soil to a foreign officer who led an unauthorized armed incursion into the country. Kainerugaba himself called it a tribute to courage, commitment, and devotion to duty. But to whose duty was that courage and devotion? Definitely not Uganda's. This wasn't Uganda defending itself. This was Uganda commemorating the man who invaded it. Second question, and this one cuts deepest. 45 Ugandan soldiers died that night, defending what was, at that moment, their country's airspace and sovereignty, regardless of who was president. There is no statue for them at Entebbe, no bronze memorial to the Ugandan lives lost defending their nation's territorial integrity. Instead, the man who led the operation that killed them now stands in bronze, holding his rifle, honored by the very institution, the Uganda military, that lost 45 of its own that night. If honoring the fallen matters, whose fallen is Uganda choosing to honor? And whose is it choosing to erase? Third, this is the very argument Kainerugaba himself tried to preempt. He said Ugandan soldiers who died that night were carrying out orders of a regime that did not represent the Ugandan people, meaning Idi Amin, not Uganda itself. But here's the flaw in that reasoning. When Israeli commandos landed uninvited and opened fire, they did not surgically target Idi Amin. They killed Ugandan soldiers. They destroyed Ugandan aircraft. They violated Ugandan airspace and Ugandan sovereignty, the state's sovereignty, not the dictator's personal property. Such an attempt to separate the regime from the nation in order to justify honoring a foreign incursion is precisely the kind of reasoning that starts to resemble Stockholm Syndrome. That is, identifying with and even memorializing the very actor who disregarded your state's sovereignty on the pretext that the government in power at the time happened to be unpopular. Uganda was not Idi Amin. Uganda is a state that existed before him and after him, and its territorial integrity doesn't become optional based on who the president or prime minister is. The fourth and hardest question, what does this say about Africa more broadly? Post-colonial African states have spent 7 decades insisting, through the OAU, then the AU, that colonial-era violations of African sovereignty were categorically wrong, and that African borders and territorial integrity are sacrosanct, never to be renegotiated by outside powers. That principle is foundational to modern African statehood. So when one of Africa's own governments builds a monument honoring a foreign military incursion onto its own soil, actively honoring the commander who led it, rather than condemning or merely acknowledging it historically, it undermines the very sovereignty doctrine African states have spent generations defending. If Uganda can celebrate such an event, what moral standing does any African state have the next time its own sovereignty is violated by a foreign power? In fairness, Uganda's framing is explicit. Kainerugaba called this an act of memory and reconciliation, strengthening Uganda-Israel relations, and drew a sharp line between Idi Amin's brutal, internationally isolated regime and the Ugandan people. Amin was a dictator accused of mass atrocities, who gave hijackers safe haven. Some will argue this is less about endorsing a sovereignty violation and more about diplomatic pragmatism, rebuilding ties with Israel 50 years on, by honoring courage and human life lost, not the politics of who invaded whom. Whether it's a convincing one, given the 45 Ugandan soldiers with no equivalent memorial, is for you to decide. Sovereignty either means something or it doesn't, and when a state honors the man who breached its own, while its own fallen soldiers remain unmarked, that's not just a diplomatic gesture. It's a question every African state should be asking itself. If this made you think, share it, and follow Unveil Africa for more.